I'm Monica Youn, and I'm a Constitutional Fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School. I think that percentage has stayed relatively stable. Now, there have been some encouraging signs, and I don't know whether they've yet been enough to move that percentage significantly, but there was a lot of talk about the small donor revolution in 2008, and I think that worked kind of in both parties. Neither Barack Obama nor John McCain were the choices of the big money people in their party, of the big money establishment. And I thought that it was incredibly encouraging that these two candidates ended up getting their party nomination. Obama, I think, largely through small donations, and McCain through a combination of small donations, big donations, and public financing. And I think that with Citizens United and with the advent of the super PAC, that's changing. I mean, you're already seeing for the 2016 election Republican wannabe candidates dancing attendance on people like Sheldon Adelson. I find this whole specter just incredibly disturbing, that you're now going to have this oligarchy of mega donors who are going to be deciding who gets to be the candidate. I mean, this word corruption gets thrown around a lot, and and you have to think about what corruption means. This is one of the big fights that we're having on a conceptual level. The Supreme Court, particularly Chief Justice Roberts, seemed to think that corruption is no more than bribery. We already have laws against bribery, so why should we worry about some more expansive notion of corruption? I think that it's very hard to demonstrate empirically that vote buying exists. You would have to tap every congressman's office. You would have to, police every donor for every little wink and nod. I think that what money has been doing is fundamentally setting the agenda in this country. Why are we not having serious discussions about climate change? Why is banking regulation taking the shape that it is? Why is it so difficult to eliminate waste in defense contracting? In the wake of Citizens United, even the majority in Citizens United, even Justice Kennedy's opinion said, well, of course we have to have robust disclosure laws. And so, when Citizens United wiped out that part of the regulatory structure, there were not disclosure laws in place. And so it seemed a very reasonable thing, something that had a substantial amount of bipartisan support, to say, okay, well, if we're going to have this new category of independent expenditures and we're going to have various other new categories of political spending, let's at least have some disclosure laws. And so and so proposals were put forth, including what was called the Disclose Act. And, being involved in, I'm not a Washington person, I'm not a lobbyist, I'm not someone who gets directly involved in that kind of advocacy. But it was interesting to me, even looking from my perspective, that what happened with the Disclose Act was once the NRA got involved, it was just a no-go. It was kind of like not one politician was willing to stand up to the NRA because of the amount of money they would be able to spend against them in a real fight. It's kind of like, people keep saying, well, you can't prove that money has power. People aren't out there actively picking fights with these huge players. I mean, what you see is a mega money player like the NRA comes into a particular dispute and just shuts it down. They don't have to spend a cent to do it. I mean, it used to be that if you were a politician who was considering some sort of, for example, energy, climate change, cap and trade legislation, and someone from ExxonMobil came to you, you would know, okay, well, they have their, $900,000 PAC that they could spend directly against me, and that's, a bit worrying. But if you know that they suddenly have their $80 billion general treasury, that, obviously they're not going to spend all of that money against you, but it just increases the amount of money they have potentially available to bring to these negotiating tables by a factor of about 50,000. I mean, I don't think that's insignificant. What's extremely frustrating about citizens, I don't think that courts should be legislating the definition of corruption. We have a Supreme Court in which not one single person has ever held any kind of an elective office. You have McCain-Feingold. You have hundreds of thousands of pages of testimony. You have members of Congress saying this kind of spending, this kind of independent spending by corporations would corrupt us, would influence our judgment, would influence what kind of bills go to the floor, would influence, what goes where on the legislative calendar, would influence legislative decision making at all kinds of levels. We think that this kind of spending is corrupting. And what you have Justice Kennedy saying in Citizens United, an act of absolutely breathtaking arrogance, is to say, oh, I don't think that's corrupting. I don't think it's corrupting as a matter of law. Independent spending cannot corrupt politicians. I don't care what the politicians or the spenders have to say about it. Yeah, I mean, if there's a smoking gun and someone with an actual gym bag filled with cash, as happened in the ASCAM scandal in Arizona, which was kind of great, then you can do something like that. But that's, those kinds of incredibly crude efforts at outright bribery, notwithstanding what's happening in the New York City mayoral race right now, are extremely, extremely rare, and, only really get the small fry, only get the idiots. Anyone who is, a real corporation is not going to get their hands involved in something like that. They don't have to. It's not the most effective way to get things done. You don't have to, if you are going to a negotiation and you're heavily armed and, you're carrying a machine gun and your opponent is not, you don't have to fire the machine gun in order to get your way. And so for the Supreme Court to be looking for that kind of, smoking gun is absurd. I think that's right. The Supreme Court has been constitutionalizing more and more of this area, making it impossible for reasonable regulation to take place. I mean, it would be kind of like if, campaign finance is a complicated area under the best of circumstances, and you have politicians, some well-meaning, some not as well-meaning, working together on various regulatory compromises in order to get this very complicated system with a lot of loopholes, a lot of potential end runs, to function. I think of it as comparable in complexity to something like the tax code. Now imagine if the Supreme Court goes in knowing nothing about tax law and just constitutionalizes whole swaths of the tax law, like you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't have anything that functions like that. It would create a regulatory nightmare, and that's what the Supreme Court in its arrogance is doing right now.